righty, well, let's go ahead and talk about homeschooling with communication in mind. Zan had mentioned about biblical worldview, and really that's the first thought I want to share with you. That when we have a biblical worldview in mind, we're thinking about the fact that we are made in God's image, that our children are made in God's image, and one benefit that we have as human beings made in his image is that we have the ability to communicate with each other in special ways. And so we're going to talk about how that looks in a homeschooling situation. But we're also going to talk about how communication is important in the way we homeschool and also throughout the subject areas. And what I want to encourage you to do is to keep in mind that communication is part of that biblical worldview. And I trust that you'll enjoy some of the suggestions that we have by looking at BJU Press materials. All right. I apologize for this, but I was at my ending slide. So now I'm going to start back at the beginning. Communication is part of something we do every day. Communication is something we do with our children, with our spouse. It's with coworkers if we have them. But in our homeschooling, I want you to think about how you're communicating with your child and about the subject areas. To communicate means to share or exchange information, news, or ideas. So the main thought here is sharing and exchanging information. So if that's true, then communication then is imparting or exchanging information. So think about the way that you're homeschooling your child. If your child is doing a lot of paper and pencil type of work, what kind of communication is happening there? And again, because we know that we're teaching with a biblical worldview in mind, we want this to be something that, since our kids are made in God's image, we want this to enhance that and to make things geared in that direction there. So the word communication and communicate also has some family words, some related words. You know, the word community. We commune with other people, right? You pray with your children, you interact with your children. We read our Bibles, we listen to preaching, we sing, we go to groups and play groups and Sunday school. And we have that sense of community where we have something in common, a feeling of fellowship. And you'll notice that in every one of these pictures, an action is happening, right? People are not just sitting still. There's interaction happening between people, which is part of the beauty of communication and part of the beauty of homeschooling. And the word communion, I know you've used that word before too, and that's the sharing or exchanging of intimate thoughts and feelings, especially on a mental or spiritual level. So when we're having conversations on the phone or we're interacting with something on the screen, talking to someone we care about or watching something interesting, there's a level of communication happening there. And again, in this particular picture, everyone's smiling. They're enjoying their communication. Of course, not all communication is this exciting, but I do want to encourage you that when you have communication in mind with your homeschooling, there's going to be more enjoyment, not only for your kids, but also for you. So let's think about your children then. What are your child's interests? What are you kids interested in? I have a son who is a film director. If I had geared most of his education toward that, I guarantee you he would have been an A+ student from the beginning. He would have loved more of the education that he had. So think about what your children's interests are. Figure out how your child learns. Is your child an auditory learner? Does your child learn visually? Is your child a hands-on learner? You know, kids learn all these different ways. And so having a variety of ways to teach your kids is really the best way to do that. But, you know, when you're thinking about the way they learn, you can gear your lessons toward their interests. And that's going to be part of the way you're communicating and allowing your child to communicate. So think about leadership abilities, or maybe a child who becomes a little older and shows the ability to speak well. Maybe to do a podcast or to be in debate. You know, you might have that child who likes to debate and discuss things. Maybe that's one way you can include that personality trait or that interest in the way that your child learns. And we'll talk about that in just a bit. This is the only slide I have with a lot of words on it, and I did that for a reason. I wanted to communicate to you in written form so that you see some things here that I think are important. In homeschooling, it isn't just about mom or dad doing the talking and the kids doing the listening. We learn to communicate in many ways, and we just talked about this just a bit ago. Verbally, our kids are using speech to send a message. Also, non-verbally, using our posture and body language, and most of us are verbal and non-verbal as we are teaching. Of course, we can write to convey a message, and also visually, things that can be seen. So to make homeschooling more interesting to the verbal, auditory, visual, and kinesthetic learners, we need to consider how communication affects their learning and their ability to respond to and apply concepts. And that's really the key to what I hope to share with you today. So let's think about how our kids are learning. Think about the ways we're teaching them, the ways that they're absorbing materials. And then how do they respond to that? Do they respond to that by paper and pencil? Do they do activities? Do they do oral reports? Are they creating something? Part of biblical worldview is also teaching our kids to be able to think so that they can use the skills that they're learning to show love to their neighbor, to be able to make a difference in the world. So understanding and applying concepts is really, really important for them. And so this gives them sort of a trial where they are at their age to be able to try out the concepts that they've learned in real life. Well, how do I do this? You might ask. Where do I get these ideas? What does this even look like? Well, you can be really creative and you can come up with ideas of your own, but I have to tell you, BJU Press has made it very possible for you in every subject to do this. If you have in mind that you want to have communication as part of the way you teach and the way your children learn, you will notice these things pop up very quickly in the lessons you're teaching your children. So here we have a Bible lesson. This is from Bible 3. And this is a story about a young girl and her brother who are being babysat for the evening. And the babysitter has babysat them before. And the kids know that she is a bookworm. And she really gets into her books. And so the young girl asks if she can watch a scary TV show. And she knows she's not allowed to watch it. Her parents have told her not to watch it. And so the babysitter said, well, you just do what you watch what your parents will allow you to watch. And she did not say yes or no to her. So the communication there was not quite a yes or no. And so the young girl decided that she was going to watch this scary show because the babysitter didn't tell her no. And so she was sort of avoiding the truth by not communicating. So even not communicating can be a problem there. And so the young girl watched the movie, the TV show, and in the middle of the night, she woke up with a bad dream. And the story goes on to tell us about how, we need to make decisions based on truth and not even kidding ourselves about what we're being taught. And so we're responsible for our actions, even as children, in the decisions we make and the way we do things. And in this case, this young girl is responsible for her communication with her babysitter. She kind of played against the babysitter, knowing that she could possibly get away with getting what she wanted there. So I'm going to show you some examples here from Bible 3, and I hope that they'll be easy to see for you. I know some of these pages are small, but I'll point out some things I think that'll be interesting to you. On the left, you see a page there where there's the widow and Elijah. And in this lesson, they're talking, you remember the story about the widow? She was running out of food and out of oil, and she planned on, making her last cakes with it, and then she was going to die because she had no more food. And so she and Elijah have a conversation. And so in this particular activity, they're cutting out the conversations, and the kids are pasting them beside the right person. So they're listening to who said what and how they interacted with each other. So they're actually doing a communication lesson about communication here. What's neat about that is, though, they're not just seeing something one-dimensionally. In this case, they have a cooking connection, and it says optional. I know it takes time to do the optional things, but I'm going to tell you that these are the things your kids remember, and these are the things that help your children to apply the concepts. And so this is an activity where your child is able to make a cake. It's unleavened bread. And you can imagine as this woman is making the cake and talking back and forth to Elijah what they're saying to each other. And then she makes him the cake, the little cake that they eat together, and what Elijah might have said. And then as Elijah prepared and provided for her through God, what her reaction was. So even just having that hands-on activity of seeing and tasting, smelling and feeling, and hearing the conversation between the widow and Elijah, that is really bringing meaning to your child. And here we see down below it where it says lesson 3, we're talking about God's word. And the lessons always start with memory verses. Often we have songs, in case we're communicating by quoting scripture together, reading scripture, quoting scripture, we're singing together. And then also here we're talking about poetry in the Bible, a form of communication, right? And so what makes a poem special? Why did the author write in the form of a poem? And then we talk about the musical instruments that are used to communicate something. Sometimes musical instruments communicate praise. Sometimes it can communicate something else. So even in these lessons where maybe they're talking about something else, communication pops out. Here you can see in the top right these 2 young girls, and they're having a good time, but unfortunately, they're talking about someone. They're gossiping. And so here we have a unit lesson, and they're talking about pure speech. And as a child, what our speech looks like and what God expects of us as children and as adults. And then we have a lesson from Job and how Job went through a very trying time and what his speech looked like and what God said about his speech. You might be asking about this timeline. The timeline I put here because it's also a form of communication. Your children can demonstrate learning and they can understand what's happening when. They can display an understanding of something by communicating with pictures, by assigning it to the right date, the right time period. And this is easy to check too, to see whether they understand or not when you do something visually. There are all kinds of graphic organizers throughout BJU Press materials. And here we have a story map where we're talking about the characters, the setting, the plot. This is really helpful information, especially for kids who are struggling, they have special needs. Also, when they're learning to write, they struggle with how to write and what to do. So they're getting some really good models in other lessons. And this comes from the Peanut Butter Friends book we talked about this morning. This is actually a book that's included in part of the lessons in Bible 3. This is a story about a young girl whose family went to Taiwan, and they are missionaries there, and she finds herself in a situation where it's very difficult to communicate with other children. Everything is very strange and different to her, and you can really put yourself in her place and understand that she really wants to serve God and to love others, but the communication is really an issue for her. And so the book goes on and gives a lot of good tips and understanding so that you see where she's learning to care about others by learning to communicate well. But also in this lesson, you'll see on the right, there's a science connection. And this is something that, again, it would take a little bit of time, but even if you would just draw the picture and maybe spend a moment or two and just talk about a prism and how we reflect light, we reflect who God is with a biblical worldview. He uses us, and that reflection encourages other people, and they see God through us by grace, through Jesus. Here on the bottom, we have a picture, and this actually comes from Heritage 6, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. In Heritage 6, we're talking about a chapter in Africa. And so we're making connections to the Bible. And this really helps a child understand when we're making connections between subjects and they see the reality that these are real people from real places. They have customs, and we can look to those cultures and learn things. That communicates information to our children, and they're able to have an understanding better of the Bible accounts that they're learning. Spelling is one of those subjects, I think a lot of people just think if we have a list, we memorize the list and then we move on. And really, you're going to hear some more about that later this week. But there's so much more to spelling. There's so many wonderful lessons in spelling. And so let me encourage you, if you're teaching materials that are parent-led, please buy the Teacher's Edition. I cannot encourage you enough to do that. Everything I'm showing you is from a Teacher's Edition so that you can see the value in that. Here on the left hand, this is from Spelling 4, near the bottom there of the picture where the cup of tea is. The student is actually learning about the sounds and the pronunciation of the letters in the spelling words. So they're learning not just the correct spelling and why it's spelled that way, but they're also learning how to pronounce words correctly. And isn't that an important thing? Not to be able just to spell them right, but to be able to communicate verbally. So communicating verbally, communicating in our writing, these are both very important things because we want to show love to our neighbors by spelling things correctly. And over here on the right, you'll find some things in the Teacher's Edition that are for advanced students and also for students that struggle. And there are some really good tips here. And these are ways to meet the needs of your children. So having something like a spelling notebook helps your kids as they're learning their words, they're writing, they're saying things, and they're reusing them in their writing. And then for the kids who really, the paper and pencil is really getting boring for them, there's so many wonderful online activities that you can find through the resources pages on BJU Press Homeschool. They have all kinds of things that your kids can do, and they can express their spelling and their math and their other subjects on technology. And that's a form of communication as well. They're learning from that technology and they're also communicating back with it. So don't be discouraged about technology. Technology is a great way to learn and to communicate if it's done correctly. And again, here we have some information on spelling and it gives some rules for proofreading. But I really appreciate this because kids are learning to proofread, but not just for the sake of spelling things correctly. And so there's a section here to the bottom right under the big section that says Proofreading Guidelines. And in this particular situation, we're asking kids to talk and verbalize about their misspelling. So there are some thinking process prompts going on here. And as they find a mistake in their spelling, have them verbalize what's wrong with it. As they're doing their proofreading on their writing activities, have them explain what's incorrect. If they use the word there, but it was the other homonym, have them explain to you what's incorrect about it. Because this there means that, but this there means something else. And as they're verbalizing to you what's wrong, that means they're understanding that. You can assess that. And that will help them to remember. And you can even have a discussion about why a word is spelled correctly or not. I will tell you, as Ann said, I've got 4 boys. They're all ranging from 29 to 34. And I'm not sure what went on in our house when they were younger. We probably talked way too much about grammar and spelling and things like that, pronunciations. But to this day, almost every meal that we end up having together as grown adults with their spouses and kids, somehow it still comes up about pronouncing something correctly or spelling something correctly. And so somehow they've inherited this trait for good or for bad. But as a mom, I've got to tell you, I chuckle a little bit when it happens because I think, well, at least they caught that, which is a good thing. Here we have on the right side, again, something that might look like grammar or writing or from reading, but this is actually from that same chapter in, or another chapter in the Heritage book, and it's about writing a haiku. So they've learned about Japan, they've learned about the culture, and now they're going to do something about their literature and writing a poem. They're learning about the value of that. They're creating a haiku, and then they're going to be doing a written presentation. And this is something you could choose to grade or not grade. And then you can study other haiku stories and things that your kids can look up, and you can share them as a family and write them together, create a little booklet if you wanted to. This can be done electronically, it can be done on a computer, it can be done by hand. But most kids enjoy doing activities like this. And again, they are communicating something that they know, their understanding of something, not only the concept of how to create a haiku, but their understanding of that type of poetry and the culture it came from, but it also expresses their personality. And this is something fun that your kids can do. Well, we've talked about heritage studies a good bit, and I want to say to you that there is a lot more to talk about as far as writing, grammar, literature, reading, but we're going to have some really great workshops about that this week. And so I'm going to kind of skip to some other subjects so that way we can cover more together. So let's talk about Heritage Studies 6 again. And here the kids are learning about the Mayan civilization, and we're talking about how the Mayans communicated and what a book looks like from the Mayan culture. Now, we know from experience how a book works. We read from left to right. Other cultures don't always do that. And so there's a really fun activity here. Again, it takes time to do that, but this is a full lesson that gives them the opportunity to do that. And so there are pages to print out, and your child needs to put this codex together. And here you can see on the right side, you can see pictures of everything that's involved there, all the parts and pieces, and then there are written directions. So even in the curriculum, even in the teacher's edition for your children, they are seeing communication to help them understand. They're also hearing you give the directions or reading that, and then they get to do a hands-on activity to put one together. And if you want to grade it, you can. There's a rubric for that as well. Your kids are going to remember these activities, and they're a lot of fun. This particular story is a very interesting story. It's a little bit heavier reading, but it's interesting because it's a legend. And this legend is actually very historical in the information that the author gives. And so this myth or legend reflects the historical information of that particular tribe. And the map that they give reference to here in the teacher's edition is pictured on the right, is there to help the children understand the continent of Africa and where Ghana is and where Kenya is, because they talk about that throughout the chapter, but particularly Kenya for this particular legend. And so this story was passed down from generation to generation. This was a story that was orally passed down and then eventually was written down. And so your kids will learn all about that all the way through elementary school. They're going to talk about fairy tales and tall tales and other stories that have been passed down from generation to generation. And in this case, the student is learning about the culture. They're learning about what it was like to live during this time period from this story that was passed down from year to year for a lot of years. And then they also have the opportunity to learn other things in addition to it. So up at the top, you see it says, what does this story communicate about the values of the Shaka people? So they're learning about the values of these people through a written communication that was passed down orally for many, many years. And so, you know, that's a nice and a fun thing to learn. There's some really good morals and values that come from that. But when you connect it to some additional things, your kids are learning so much more. And here you can see on the bottom that there's an opportunity to build a relief map of Africa. Or they might want to do a news article. They could actually pretend that they lived during that time period or add to the legend if they wanted to. What about a missionary story about David Livingstone? Wow, what a great place to put that in and make a read aloud for your kids. And then also giving them opportunities to study plants and animals in that area. You could actually do a country report. You could go kind of crazy with this if you wanted to. And you can include kids that aren't even in sixth grade in this. What a valuable lesson. And this might be a lesson that you might have looked at and said, well, that's a lot of, it's not that interesting to me. But you know what? With all these things planned in the teacher's edition as options for you that you can pick and choose from, you have so many opportunities to choose communication for your kids. So now that they've understand what an oral story is, they have an activity that they're going to do, and they're going to talk to a family member and find out something about the family and share it with other people. I remember when my boys did this activity too. They talked to their grandparents, they got a story from them, and they sat down and shared it. And you could actually do an oral presentation rubric if you wanted to, or you can do it just for fun. You can videotape it, send it to the grandparents. And then here's another activity possibility, making tie-dye. And we talk about the artwork and the intricate work that people did, and how very specific they were, and the bright colors, and where they got the indigo to make these beautiful, beautiful colors. And so as they're designing and planning and using the dye, they're sort of imaging forth what other people have done before. And this is all a reflection of being image bearers, right? And maybe you make this and you give it to someone, give it to someone as a gift, or you just proudly enjoy wearing it as you've learned something hands-on. All right, so that is heritage studies. Let's talk about math. And we're going to go to first grade here, so nothing overly complicated, but don't worry, we're going to talk about economics in a minute here. How do we communicate in first grade? Well, you know, the teacher or the parent does some reading. If you do video courses, the teacher does some talking. Your children listen and they look. And so in this case, Digit the Clown and Cecilia are talking about flowers, and they're talking about a theme here of flowers. And so they are creating number sentences out of an illustration. So the children are listening to the story, and they are in their minds following along and creating math in their minds. But then they can also demonstrate by using the cubes. So the mom here is reading a story. She could also be showing by demonstrating, and she's also writing a number sentence. Okay, so there's communication by the parent here, and also a child listening here. But additionally, the child is following along, and they're following along by demonstrating either with a pencil and showing the number sentences using the numerals, and or they're showing with cubes. So in this cute activity here, Digit and Cecilia go to the park, and they notice it's kind of boring around the picnic table, and they decide to make it pretty there by making planters. And isn't that a lovely idea? Being part of the community and doing something so other people can enjoy God's nature, right? That's part of a biblical worldview. And so here's a little example of the area where the picnic table is. And so you get to help design this area for a flower garden. And so the children take their little cubes and they put them around the garden to make like an illustration of what the flower garden looks like. And then they use the cubes to help them write a number sentence. So they're illustrating with flowers, pictures of flowers, or they're using numbers, or they're using cubes. And as they're doing that, they're communicating to you what they understand. And if the numeral that they're writing doesn't match, then you know that there's a concept issue that you need to work on there. But in the meantime, this is fun. Math is fun. And then if you notice to the bottom, they're composing a word problem. So now we're going to do something a little different. Now we're going to do word problems. And the whole point in math of learning all the wonderful concepts that we learn is to be able to solve problems. And so now, if you wanted to, your children could create their own word problems and solve them, and they can do that using cubes or anything else that they want to demonstrate that they understand as they learn. All righty. I hope you're getting some fun ideas here for communication with your kids. A high school level, economics, learning about money, having your child look at money. Now, I have to say, we're talking about 10s, 20s, 50s, 100s. Those may not be as plentiful to check out, but maybe you can find a way to get your hands on some of these, or at least look online for your kids to be able to recognize what's on the front, what's on the back of a dollar bill or a $10 bill, $20 bill, $100 bill, and what money looks like and what it means and what its value is in the U.S. compared to other countries. And so they're understanding how to communicate financially. And here's an activity where they're actually talking about choices, and values. And I love this so much because they're talking about what something's value is to one person compared to another. And here they're talking about a lawnmower. And I have to tell you, this is really, really interesting. I'm going to go to the next slide so you can see this. Because yesterday we had a conversation at church with somebody who is a restaurant owner. And he told us that his restaurant does not have a delivery service. And so he bartered, I will tell you this, it's Chick-fil-A. He bartered so many box meals with another individual to have them provide oil changes and maintenance and things for his people to be able to deliver meals. And then he bartered some more with some meals to have people do the deliveries. And so, you know, what seems like, oh, chicken sandwiches, that's fun and that's nice. That has some value. But to him, what really had value was being able to barter those chicken sandwiches for a service that would have been very expensive for him or inconvenient for him. So what the value of something was to him was different from the value of what someone else saw, and they were able to barter with each other. And so here's an activity where your kids can actually barter. You can find some things around the house, and I guarantee you the kids are always fighting over something. And so maybe pulling those things out and having them barter and learn what is valuable to you right now. They might learn that they thought something was really important and they find out later it wasn't nearly as important as they thought it was. But something might be very special to a child and they can barter for that and learn that wonderful skill. What about geometry? You think, wow, geometry, that's just a lot of symbols and a lot of numbers and there's nothing really fun in there. Listen, there's so much wonderful information about communication in geometry. What about reasoning and proofs? Helping your children to understand inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning and coming to a conclusion. I love what it says here at the bottom of the teacher's edition. It says motivational idea. The students may be interested in knowing that both inductive and deductive reasoning are used extensively in the sciences. Okay, so scientists are using this reasoning to form a conclusion. And so then they apply this to a theory, to situations, to attempt to prove or disprove something. They're going to be doing science for a number of years here. So this is really important for them to understand. And they can actually do a word study. You can have them Google and look online for a word study on inductive reasoning and geometry. And all throughout our curriculum, we have kids have the possibility of them going further by doing word studies and doing keyword studies to help them with their communication, to understand concepts even better. So those vocabulary words can be pulled out of just about anywhere. Here we're talking about reasoning again, and on the very bottom it says, after this chapter, you should be able to do these certain things. And these are all part of critical thinking and higher level thinking skills. Kids are learning to write proofs. They're learning with practice. The kids are able to share their own innovations that are duplicated from God's creation. And here you can see on the right, we're talking about biomimicry and how a lot of things in nature are that way. And so the children are then encouraged to find these things in nature and then actually maybe to create their own artwork based on biomimicry. And so it's not just about learning this stuff. It's not just about memorizing the words or solving problems, but it's also understanding who God is, that communication of who he is through nature. And then your child being able to communicate what he understands about God and about nature through those lessons there. All right, we just have just a little bit more here that I thought would be interesting to you. And this is from Earth Science. And we talk quite a bit about carbon dating, and we talk about fossils, and the bottom line when we talk about a biblical worldview. And I really appreciate what BJU Press has done to show all the different angles of what people are saying scientifically and also from their worldview. And the bottom line is really what it says in the bottom paragraph here. Sometimes we simply cannot present scientific evidence that validates a portion of Scripture, but Scripture does not need scientific evidence to prove it is true. In the end, we must exercise faith that the Bible is true, and when correctly interpreted, in spite of all the evidence to the contrary or of lack of evidence, this is what faith is all about. This is significant for your children. And so to be able to defend their faith, to understand apologetics, to be able to understand what God says about the flood and about science, and to understand what other people say about those things, and then to be able to speak intelligently, to be able to persuade someone to know who God is and to understand that he's the great creator and the lover of our souls. And so in learning about fossilization, they're learning about actually, so interesting, California. When you read in the Bible about Noah, do you think about California? That's not my first thought. Oh, there's so many wonderful things to learn here. And so they can communicate by having conversations and reading, but they also get to learn by doing a hands-on activity here. And they're doing some radiocarbon dating in this lab activity. So they're actually doing something that scientists do to learn for themselves. Also, on the right side, it gives some suggestions for a hands-on fossil activity where they're doing some classifying, and then they're talking about it, visually showing things. And then the last idea, which is something your family can do together, is a field trip. Okay, you drive together, you see this thing, you experience it with other people in person, you're seeing, you're hearing, you're touching, and then all of a sudden your kids start talking about the things they saw in their books because it comes to life, it becomes real to them. And those are the moments as a homeschooling parent where you think, wow, our kids get this, our kids understand this, and they love learning. We want your kids to love learning. We want them to love to know who God is and to know about his word. And that can be done through spelling and through geometry and through science and through all the things that we talked about today. And so that I hope that as you think about communicating throughout the curriculum, that as you're homeschooling your kids, that communication is in mind as you're looking at their lessons overall. Whether you're using parent-led materials or you're using our wonderful video courses, those teachers are taking many, many opportunities to take your kids to those places. But you are still the parent. You can still pick and choose what they learn, how they learn. And don't let them just sit in front of that computer and entertain themselves with these great lessons from their teachers. Let them come back and communicate with you. And I know they do. I know they tell you what they say about their lessons, but go a little farther and talk about it over supper. Have those great communications with your kids about who God is, what he's doing in their life, and how they've learned something great through BJU Press homeschool materials.